Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and we are here for my NACL 2025 Summer Split Primer and Power Rankings video. We are already back into the domestic conversations as we're starting to talk about some of the leagues that are already coming back after MSI. I know it's only been like a day and a half since the last video I posted, the finals of MSI, but you know, it's coming fast and quick here in terms of getting right back into domestic play, and that starts with my NACL Primer. I'm very excited for this split. Spoiler alert for how things go throughout this entire video. The NACL talent level has gone up so much in the summer split as opposed to the spring split. I think the floor is much higher in terms of where these teams are at. I think the ceiling is also arguably much higher in terms of where some of these teams are at, and that's just incredibly exciting to talk about. I think we're in a spot that's a lot better for the NACL than we were in spring, but that could be expected going into summer. I'm excited to talk about all of it. Of course, let me know what your thoughts are down in the comment section below. I've got a couple of caveats. Obviously, we're going to go over, all of the, actuallys at the start of the video, as we always do, but I'm curious to know where you guys, put a lot of these teams, whether or not you think I'm over or underrating some of these rosters and some of these players, because, we're going to be going over everything here today. I'm just curious to know what you guys' thoughts and opinions are on a lot of these players and a lot of these teams, so leave that down in the comment section below. But without further ado, let's get into the video itself. If you are new to these primer power rankings videos that we do at the beginning of every single split that we cover, essentially what we're going to do in today's video is go from number 10 to number 1 in my personal power rankings, talking about every single team, kind of giving my expectations, playstyle thoughts that you can have for these teams going into the split, whether or not I think they're going to over or underperform a lot of people's expectations, and we will also be ranking every single player within their own position from number 1 to number 10 as well. So all the top laners from 1 to 10, all the junglers from 1 to 10, etc., etc. That's how we are going to go about today's video. Couple of caveats that I always have to give at the start of this. First and foremost, it's just my opinion. That's the biggest caveat, and it's always going to be the biggest caveat. There is a reasonable amount of, disagreement that can happen within a list like this no matter what. So if you see me rank a team, 5th, and you think they should be 3rd, or you think they should be 7th, or whatever, we're probably not all that off in terms of just where these teams land. Most of these teams can move up or down 1 or 2 spots, and I'm really not going to disagree with you in any measurable way. I'll kind of talk about the break points for me in terms of where I think teams separate themselves from other teams in terms of just consistency. But at the end of the day, if you have a slight disagreement, if you're like, oh my god, I can't believe he put this player as the 4th best mid laner when he's clearly the 2nd best mid laner, we're probably pretty close. In terms of actual analysis, I wouldn't, sit there and be like, he completely disagrees with my thoughts and opinions. So that's the main thing. I think it's just that these ratings are very flexible, and I hope that they change throughout the split. But that kind of bleeds into my second point, which is that especially for the NACL, the only tier 2 region we actually cover on this channel, this is a floor ranking. This is not a projection of where I think these teams are going to be by the end of the split. Right now, I'm looking at these rosters and I'm saying number 10 is the team I feel the least confident is going to be able to adapt to this level, and number 1 is the team that I think I'm the most confident is going to be able to adapt to this level. I hope I'm wrong on this list, which I know is something that not a lot of analysts are going to say, but I hope I'm wrong because I hope that there are teams that overperform my expectations in the same way that a team like Conviction did last split, where, they ended up top 3 in terms of their playoff placement, where they beat Near Airport and ended up being a team that really overperformed. Even Winthrop, overperformed a lot of people's expectations. I'm hopeful that there are going to be other teams this split that do the exact same thing. I'll kind of call out the ones that I would, kind of expect to be in the running for something like that, and obviously, we'll talk about that as we go throughout the video, but don't sit here and look at a team, in 10th or 9th or 8th and say, oh, he expects them to get 9th or 8th. I don't expect anything from these teams. These are just basically these are confidence rankings rather than just power rankings, if you will. How confident am I that you're a team that's going to be able to succeed at that level, at this level? You're going to be higher up, obviously, if I feel more confident, and you're going to be lower down if I feel less confident. So that's kind of the main caveat. Those are the main things going into this, and that applies to player rankings as well. There are some players that will definitely perform better than what their rankings are, but for now, I kind of have to rank these players on how confident I am that they're going to be successful at this level. So with all of that out of the way, I do appreciate you guys sticking around for the intro. It's time to get into the video itself. Like I said in the intro, we are going to be going from number 10 to number 1 in my personal power rankings and my personal confidence rankings, and so that means we start off with number 10. And honestly, this was a pretty difficult decision. I think that there are a lot of teams that theoretically could compete for a top, 7 or 6-ish spot in the NACL. I really don't think there is a gigantic gap between a lot of the teams near the middle to bottom of the standings, but someone had to come in at number 10, and for me, that's going to be Vancouver Impact or Jolly Rogers or whatever they're going by. It does look like they've secured a sponsor in Vancouver Impact. Liquipedia has updated. Obviously, I want to give a big shout out at the start of this video to Zav, who posted the spreadsheet publicly. That's how I know I'm good to make this video in terms of actually posting this, so I appreciate that. He posted it on Twitter, and I would not feel comfortable, releasing this information until teams did if he didn't do that. So, credit to Zav, but also Vancouver Impact is coming in at number 10 for me. I still think this team has the potential to be top 6 if everything goes right, and that should go to show you just where teams are at right now in the NACL. All due respect to Polestar, it's not like we have like a Polestar this split where it's like your 10th place and anything else would be surprising. I really don't think there is that, but I do think Vancouver Impact, at least for me, probably have the lowest floor of any team in the NACL. So quickly, let's go ahead and talk about what you're seeing on your screen. First, at the top, you can see the team name, in this case, Vancouver Impact. I put JR in parentheses because Jolly Rogers is what they were in the promotion tournament, so that's what people are going to know them as, but they got a sponsor going into the NACL so that they could actually pay their players. It goes and talks about how they finished in the spring split. In this case, this team qualified by 3-2ing Pulse in the lower bracket of the open qualifiers, and they only got the spot via Near Airport, backing out. This would not be a team that ended up making the NACL if it weren't for Near Airport not being in the split and having 3 spots open in the qualifiers. You can see where I personally power rank them below that, in this case 10th. In parentheses there, you're going to see how things have quote-unquote changed. This is a little weird for the promotion teams. I thought it was easiest to talk about the teams that they replaced. In this case, like Vancouver Impact is kind of taking Near Airport spot because it was that 3rd spot available in the promotion tournament, and so all of the parentheses are in comparison to Near Airport. That's going to make a lot more sense for the organizations that were actually in the league last split, where it's like, well, I'm just kind of comparing it to what I thought their team was last split versus what it is now. Obviously, if you don't like that I'm doing that for the promotion teams, then just ignore the parentheses. That's totally fine. And then you can see all 5 of the starters below that, top, jungle, mid, AD carry, and support. Shout out Liquipedia for getting me as many pictures as I could possibly get here. A lot of these players are just going to have the standard Liquipedia background face because we don't have anything posted on them for headshots. But you can see every single player listed there. You can see where I personally rank them in their position below that. In Dragoon's case, I think he's the number 9 top laner, Will the number 8 jungler, etc., and we'll talk about that. And then, of course, like I said in the parentheses, how that changed from last split's version of the team, in this case, Near Airport, because they are taking that spot. Obviously, again, we'll go in depth on everything playstyle-wise and just player-wise as we go throughout this, but I hope that explains what you're seeing on the screen for the rest of the video. But with that introduction out of the way, we're done with all the preamble. Let's get into the analysis for Vancouver Impact in particular. Their lineup is looking like Dragoon in the top lane, Will in the jungle, Sudsy in the mid lane, Zev at AD carry, and Nukes at support. Really like this roster from a conceptual standpoint. I think a lot of the players on this team obviously have familiarity playing together. You have players like Dragoon and Sudsy that played for Goon last year, which was obviously a big plus. You have Will and Sudsy who were playing for Akuma at the beginning of the year in the open qualifiers. Zev and Nukes were playing for Dorado as a bot lane duo in the open qualifiers at the beginning of the year, and then all of them coming together to play for Jolly Rogers. And even some of these players like Dragoon and Will have tier 2 experience, have played at this level. Will in particular has had success at this level in the past. At one point was looked at as a top tier prospect in North America, but I just have a little bit of a concern about whether or not that's going to be able to translate. We can talk about the good first. That's how I typically like to structure this, is I want to go over the players I feel good about and then kind of get into some things that I think could go wrong for these teams. Also, one thing that's worth noting, I can't believe I didn't say this in the preamble, not every position is created equally. Like, that should be obvious to a lot of people, but, being the 5th best player in one position doesn't mean that you're equally as good as the 5th best player in another position. Some positions are better at this level, and some positions are worse at this level. You can be a mid laner that's pretty darn good that I feel okay about playing at this level, like Sudsy is, but there are a lot of mid laners that I feel pretty comfortable about at this level, so unfortunately he still comes in at number 10. I hope that makes a lot of sense. Like, we'll talk about it. Just because a player has the same number grade as another player, in this case Sudsy and Zev, doesn't mean that I feel the exact same way about those players. So let's get into things. Will is the player I feel the best about on this team, not just because he has the most experience in Tier 2, but because I actually think he was really good in the open qualifiers in the promotion tournament that they played here. You could make a really strong argument that Will was the best jungler in that tournament, just in terms of actual production. Obviously Kenvi is somebody that I rate a little bit higher than Will, quite a bit higher than Will, as you'll see throughout this video, but, Will really impressed me, and I really haven't found a time where I've been super unimpressed with Will. I think the only time I can think back to was probably the AoE split, where it was just like, it's okay. Even going back to that like Mirage Alliance split in tier 2, where that entire team was just catastrophically bad. He was the one player that was actively going out and trying to win games, even if you could call a lot of his kills and his KDA like cleanup time, whatever you wanted to say. I talked about it on the channel at the time. Will was still the one player on that team that I think was showing a lot of promise. He's always been a player that I believed in, even going back again to like the 100 Thieves days, when it really felt like he was going to be the next breakout, the Dignitas days, when it felt like he was going to be a breakout jungler. It just never really came to fruition. He's going to have to kind of be the captain of this team. He certainly was in the promotion tournament. And I'm excited to see if he can keep that form going. 8 is kind of a floor for him. I think that there is a lot of upside in terms of what Will can become on this team, but he's definitely the player, at least from my perspective, with the most like high-end potential. And if he's really good, he could elevate this team. I think the top side of the map could actually be pretty solid here for Vancouver Impact. And then for Dragoon, I think he's obviously the one that a lot of people are going to point to. Glad that he's in tier 2. It's always fun to see somebody who is so like successful at the tier 3 level get their opportunity in tier 2. I can't imagine how many times this guy has qualified for tier 1. Same for Sudsy in the mid lane, where it's just like, or for tier 2, I should say, where it's just like he keeps winning the promotion tournament and then not getting a spot in the NACL. I'm glad to see both of them get it here. Dragoon's a good player. He's very versatile in terms of what his top lane picks are. I believe he had the most unique champion picks of anybody in the promotion tournament. Jolly Roger played some of the most games. I think they did play the most games, maybe outside of Pulse. It was between those two, obviously, but he had a ton of unique picks, things like the Mordekaiser and the set. Like, that's the kind of stuff you can expect to come out of Dragoon. That's kind of the play style expectation for a player like that. And I think generally speaking, that's a big positive overall for VI, because they can get a lot of counter picks. They can actually play for red side more so than maybe some other teams at this tournament, because Dragoon can be so flexible on the top side of the map. That being said, like, the mechanical ceiling has never been crazy high for Dragoon in comparison to some of the other top laners, and he's not been particularly successful at the tier 2 level, at least in totality. I think he theoretically could be, but again, it's something I need to see a bit more of. And then Sudsy's the other player that I feel really good about in the mid lane here. Another player who's kind of been on the cusp of being in tier 2 for a long time and finally does get his opportunity to play here. Again, I really like the, I guess, general vibe that we're getting between Will and Sudsy as your mid-jungle duo. I like the way that they play off of each other, mostly because Sudsy's a very aggressive player. He wants to play things like Yone and Sylas. He doesn't want to sit back and play control mages, and so I think that does help. Like, tempo at this level I think is very important, and I think that that's something that could be positive. But as you can see from the player rankings, with him coming in as my number 10 mid laner, there's a lot of mid laners at this level that are really good. Like, the floor of that position is very high just in terms of where a lot of these players come in, and it's just difficult to project that he is going to be definitely better than a lot of those guys when he really hasn't shown that he can be. So for now, I'm taking a bit of a pessimistic approach, but again, it's the top side of the map, and specifically jungle mid, where I really feel like this team can actually generate quite a few advantages if they are going to play. Now, you have to have a bit of a concern for me to get 10th place, and I think the bot lane is that concern for me. Zev and Nukes coming in as the AD carry and support duo. I'm not going to mince words here. I would expect this to be the worst bot lane in the NACL right now in terms of what I've seen on tape. I know this is coming right after MSI, so I do have to preface some things. I watched the promotion tournament, and I got to the big games that happened in the open qualifiers, and, I do remember a lot of stuff from the split 1, the spring split open qualifiers as well, but these are players that, for the most part, I'm just looking at their most recent performances, and Zev and Nukes were not really all that great for me in the promotion tournament. I'm very concerned specifically about Zev. Nukes has some playmaking instincts. I think as an engager, he can be really interesting. He hits that gigantic Nico ultimate in the promotion tournament that everybody kind of talks about, and Nico was clearly the champion that they felt the best playing around. But even things like Nautilus and Alistair, I think, make a lot of sense, for VIP or VI or whatever they're going by as well. And so Nukes, I think, is generally an interesting support prospect, but again, somebody who just doesn't really have a ton of experience at this level. Zev, I'm just not, I don't know, I'll need to see it. It's a to-be-determined thing. I was watching, especially their series against Pulse, which, by the way, they went to 5 against Pulse, and as much as I want to give Pulse credit for really stepping up when it mattered and actually pushing a lot of teams to the brink when we didn't really expect them to do so, Pulse was a team that did not look particularly viable at the tier 2 level. They looked like a team that were consistently outclassed by everyone and really only ever never picked up wins when the other team was underperforming. You know, for this team to need to go to 5 against Pulse isn't a great sign from my perspective, even if, again, I do want to say Pulse played better in the promotion tournament than I expected them to. They were a lot more competent than I think I was, you know, really expecting out of that team. I didn't think they were even going to beat Cupid, and let alone, you know, go on and push Jolly Rogers to 5. But, you know, it is something worth talking about. And I think the bot lane in general, Zev in general, was probably the player that I was like, okay, you got to start stepping up. And it just never really felt like it happened. Maybe it will, because I do think that there is a world where, you know, the small sample size that I'm seeing isn't indicative of where Zev and Nukes are as a bot lane. But I definitely feel better about the top side of the map. Will is going to be a player that I'm really keeping my eye on. I imagine he's going to get a lot of prio on this team, whether it's on things like Jarvan, you know, that he's always been really good at as a creation tool, or maybe he pulls out things like Kindred that he's played in the past. Obviously, I'm just interested to see where that goes. Dragoon and Sudsy, I think, are going to be fine, mechanically speaking. If this bot lane can be better than what I'm projecting right now, which is probably the lowest floor lane in the entire league, then I think Vancouver Impact absolutely can be in the upper sections. This is a Jolly Rogers team that beat, you know, 3/5 of the members of Conviction, who are higher than them on this power rankings in the open qualifiers. And I think that's obviously something to look at. But overall, right now, I'm just kind of, the floor ranking, if we're doing that, a confidence ranking, I just have a little bit more confidence in everybody else as opposed to VI right now. Then moving on to my number 9 team in my power rankings, and it will be yet another team that qualified through the promotion tournament. It's Dorado Gaming coming in at number 9 for me. I do think they have to be considered better right now than Vancouver Impact, than Jolly Rogers. I do think there's an argument that they should be higher than this on this list, because I think that they looked pretty exceptional in their win over Pulse. And again, Pulse kind of showed up at that tournament. There were a couple of moments, especially that bot lane, really showed up at that tournament, and Dorado really just kind of embarrassed them. Shochi in particular really embarrassing Adam, which obviously we'll talk about because, you know, Shochi's a player that I expect to do really well this split, but Dorado, I think, still has some question marks for me that keep them out of that upper echelon, maybe in an opposite way to what I talked about with Vancouver Impact in the number 10 spot. So let's get into it. Their lineup is looking like Ariana in the top lane, Kaido in the jungle, Shochi in the mid lane, Sushi at AD carry, and Mixture at support. Obviously, most of these players are returning from their qualification in the promotion bracket. The only thing that is worth noting about the change to this team is obviously a new AD carry. Sushi is coming in. Fadachan is out. He will be playing for a different team that we will talk about a bit later on in today's video. But I think you could make an argument that this gives the team an even higher upside. Sushi looked incredible in his small stint with Near Airport last split. So we'll talk about it as we go along. But like I said, there's a lot to like about this team. And I think that has to start with my guy, a guy I've really gone to bat for on this channel for years and years now in Shochi in the mid lane. Somebody who, you know, even going back to the Cincinnati Fear Days, especially going back to the Cincinnati Fear Days, I was saying was one of the elite mid laners in tier 2 when there were, you know, 16 teams in this league. Like, I think Shochi has that kind of upside. I think the concern and the problem for Shochi is just that he's kind of been put into a position where he had the Supernova tenure and things didn't exactly go as planned. He ends up getting replaced by Toasty on that team, who is one of the best prospects in North America, and the CCG team that he gets replaced on, like that he goes to after Supernova, just doesn't end up, you know, performing up to expectations. I think he's asked to do a lot more than you would like to see from a player like Shochi in a situation like that, and it just doesn't really end up going well. He's kind of been working his way back up, but he's been very close to tier 2 basically all year long, and obviously qualifies here being arguably the best player on the team. In fact, I would say that he was the best player on the team in that promotion tournament. I think Shochi was incredible. Like I said, he full gapped Adam. He was up like 5,000 gold every single game against Adam when they went up against Polestar. Now, Adam can have games like that. As we know, he's a very feast or famine mid laner, but the thing that makes Shochi so difficult to play into, and the reason he's such an interesting player at this level, somebody that I think still can rise to being, you know, in the top 3, top 4 in terms of mid laners, is that he's kind of built in that, like, you know, secondary carry mold. And I don't want to say that as a negative. I actually think that's a huge positive for him as a player. What really worked on Fear was that Perry could play really aggressive picks in the jungle. He could be allowed to play with a lot of tempo because Shochi was constantly creating lane priority in the mid lane and constantly moving to help out Perry and, you know, creating a lot of situations in that instance. I think that was something that also helped Kenvi when he was playing on Supernova. Go watch Kenvi that split. He was really good because Shochi's just one of those players that kind of makes a lot of his teammates look better. Obviously, you think about a lot of the creative counter picks, you think about the Akshan, you think about the Yone, you know, the things that can come out that can really kind of destroy people, but he can play anything. He's, you know, very versatile in the mid lane, and I think he can even, you know, stand back and play a lot more controlled. We saw him have a lot of success on things like Orianna in his time in the NACL, and so I feel really good about about any team around here in the standings having a player like Shochi, because I do think he can just kind of be glue in the middle of the map, and he can elevate players around him, which I'm not sure a lot of other players that are really good at this stage can do. And so I feel good about Shochi. And then the other players I think to talk about, you can kind of talk about in any order. I do want to give praise to the bot lane here. I think both of them are players I'm very interested in seeing. Sushi in particular obviously really made a name for himself last split when he was on near airport or when he was filling in for Doublelift, because you could argue he was better than Doublelift in his small time there. He played 1 week of the regular season and I gave him player of the week for the entirety of the NACL. That's how good his performances were when he was given an opportunity to play. He even got a chance to play in the playoffs as well and looked very good for near airport in that instance. I think this team is going to be very excited to bring him on. 8 is like the absolute floor, I think, for what Sushi can offer. I think this is a guy who can be a #1 option in the NACL soon. I don't know if that's going to be right now, though. I think there is a reason that, you know, a lot of teams weren't lining up to just like throw everything at him. I think that there are some things he still needs to work on, but the potential is there. If this guy turns into the next, you know, Chrome, Aaron, whatever you want to say, or what Levitate was last year for Blue Otter, I don't think I'm really going to be all that surprised. Sushi is a player you have to keep an eye on, and Mixture is more than good enough as a support to get the best out of someone like Sushi. I've always liked Mixture. I was honestly surprised that a team didn't take a punt on him in Tier 2 at the beginning of the year. There were some teams that I think really could have benefited from having a support like Mixture in. There were moments in the promotion tournament where I think he could have been a bit more aggressive, but that's really like the only major negative I can give, and generally that's the only major negative I can give Dorado, is sometimes they don't push their advantages as hard as like incredibly aggressive teams will, but he had a great promotion tournament. I thought he was really good there. His tape has always in Tier 3 been something that's impressed me. I think this bot lane's going to be really good, and I think Shochi in the mid lane is going to make that even better in terms of just generating a lot of that pressure with his good laning phase. But, you know, kind of the opposite of Vancouver Impact, it's the top side of the map that I have more questions on. Now, Ariana is somebody that I'm actually really excited to see play at the Tier 2 level. This is somebody who came over from Europe, I believe at the beginning of this year. You know, time kind of blends together for me, but he's somebody that, you know, really I hadn't heard of before, you know, watching the promotion tournament this split or watching the open qualifiers in split 1, where it was like, oh, you know, this is somebody that I kind of have to keep an eye out for. And then I watched him play in the promotion tournament and I'm like, oh, actually, he's kind of a jack of all trades top laner. He kind of can do a little bit of everything, which I think is really interesting. I think that fits with the identity of this team, which is, you know, kind of elevating everybody else, a great group of players that turns into an even better team, that kind of mentality. I think Ariana kind of fits into what this team wants to do in that regard. The only concern that I had watching the tape, because he was very good, very consistent, is it didn't really feel like he was an expert at anything. Like the jack of all trades, master of none kind of mentality, that can still be very valuable in the NACL, but typically speaking, I think that there can be a lower floor on that kind of play style if you're not quite at the bar to reach the rest of the top laners in the league, especially in that role now with laning being so much more important and lack of resources being so much more important, with lane swaps kind of being, you know, quote unquote back, but a lot more flexible in terms of how they're pushed out. You know, Ariana is going to need to be a player that can survive in a situation against teams that are really good, pressuring him and trying to put him in positions where he's down a ton of gold. He needs to still be useful in those instances, and I just need to see that happen. Now, I think that absolutely can happen. Ariana is a player that I did like tape-wise. I think there's an argument, again, that he was the most consistent top laner in the entire promotion tournament from a game-to-game basis, because there just weren't really a lot of terrible performances out of him. But I do think that there is, again, an inherent floor with a player like this that I kind of need to see proven it's not there before I end up going full in. And then you have Kaido in the jungle. You know, Kaido's been somebody that I've talked about on this channel, obviously formerly City Witty, who we covered pretty extensively on the channel when he was playing regularly in the NACL in 2023. He's a player that I thought had upside, had a lot of traits that could lead to him being a successful jungler at this level. I've not really seen it put together just yet. I do think that there is a world where, again, playing with Shochi just makes every jungler better. It's kind of just been the case. That was the case on CCG when I remember Kryra had his little stint there, even Chad, like when he had his time on CCG, like even then, like you were still seeing a better version of those junglers because of Shochi. It's just kind of the pattern that I've seen with him as a mid laner. Like Kaido could very much be a part of that, and I don't think he was bad in the promotion tournament, but I do think I do have some concerns just in terms of the tape that I've seen previously, because jungle is actually really scary here. We already talked about a player like Will for Vancouver Impact. That's a player that I think can take over a game at a tier 2 level, and he's already rated number 8. Not that I think his floor is crazy high, just that I think the ability to win games is absolutely there. I just have yet to see that out of Kaido, and it's kind of the same thing with Ariana, and even going to someone like Mixture or Sushi, like they haven't gotten extended runs at the tier 2 level and proven that they can elevate a team. And when you're talking about a team that's full of good players that turns into a great team, players that maybe aren't, the most dominant in terms of, what they are, like pushing their advantages, Shochi really the only one who has experience doing that at this level, that could turn into a team that yet, struggles to find their own win conditions throughout a lot of these games. I don't think that's going to happen. I think Dorado is going to be a scary team, and if I had to bet, I would absolutely bet that they are not bottom 2 coming out of this split. But I think in terms of a floor, there are just too many players here that have things to prove. Mixture has never really played at this level. Sushi barely has experience at this level. Ariana has never played at this level. Kaido and Shochi have time at the tier 2 level. Shochi in particular has had success here, a lot of success, but this is a thing where you're looking at this team and you're wondering, what's the worst version of them? 10th place. That's just unfortunately kind of the truth with a lot of players that, you don't know how when you have most of your roster with no clue how they're going to perform in tier 2. It just kind of is the reality, but I would bet against that. I would bet that this team is a lot closer to being 6th than they are to being 10th. Now, whether that lands them, in the top 7 or so, I think is to be determined, but I think the floor here is low. I think the ceiling here is pretty high. But then moving on to number 8 in my power rankings, and honestly, if you want to talk about teams with low floors, high ceilings, that embodies this team, it's Conviction coming in at number 8. I just couldn't justify putting them any higher than number 8. Quite frankly, I think if we're being realistic, and if I wanted to say this is a true floor ranking, like a confidence ranking, they would come in at number 10, because I have no clue what this team is going to be. I have no clue how they're going to perform regularly throughout an entire split, but I do have a lot of faith in the individual talent of the players on this team. And obviously, if you are familiar with, any of these 5 players, you will know that they're going to try. They're not just going to phone it in, or at least I would hope that they're going to try. It looks like they are, which is a good thing. So let's go ahead and talk about our content org here for the summer split in the NACL. Their lineup is looking like TF Blade in the top lane, Perry in the jungle, Cat Evolved in the mid lane, Viper at AD carry, and Stunt at support. We can go through each of these guys specifically. The only thing I really want to say is I don't really know if this was the right move for Conviction. I'm not going to sit here and say that it was the wrong one. Maybe they were already getting players poached and they just needed to figure out a way to stay relevant in the league without, going to a bunch of young players. But this is a team that, of course, finished 3rd in the spring split. They ended up, just being very close to making finals, going the distance against DarkZero Dragonsteel and being 1 game away from being a top 2 team in the NACL, and they blow everything up and go for a content team. We'll see how that ends up paying off. I'm not saying anything negative about the players involved in the content org. We'll talk about why I think there is some optimism that they could be pretty good for this roster, but it definitely is an interesting decision. And if this team is closer to 7 or 8 in terms of the standings, people are really going to look and judge Conviction, I think, after that kind of performance. So we'll quickly talk about it here. That's kind of just the aside. We'll talk about every single other player other than Darkwings, who's in the LTA now. So we'll talk about every single other player that was on Conviction later on in the video, but I just figured it was something worth talking about at the beginning of this segment. Let's get into the roster. The players that I feel the best about. Well, first and foremost, TF Blade at the very least played last split, so we kind of have an idea of what he's going to look like at a competitive level, which is a good thing. I would rate him about mid-table in terms of top laners last split. It's why he comes in at number 5 for me in terms of top laners. Do I think his production suffers at least a little bit because of the fact that he's no longer playing with Spica and Pobelter as his mid-jungle duo, who were just absolutely tremendous last split? Yeah, I do think that maybe his aggressiveness on the top side can be punished a bit more, but I think the encouraging signs for me was that Near Airport had a very good win rate when this guy just sucked it up and played tanks on the top side, and that was something that I think was an encouraging trade. It was whether or not TF Blade was going to be able to adapt to competitive. I think that kind of proved itself to be yes, because quite frankly, he's the player with the least amount of competitive experience on this team. Even still, almost every single other person on this team has had experience extensively either in tier 2 or in tier 1 in Viper and Stunt's case. So Obviously, we'll go on that, but TF Blade is the player with the most recent showing in terms of actual NACL tape. Everybody else here, boy am I lucky that they streamed all their scrims, and boy am I lucky that, D had, their match against Jolly Rogers posted onto the Titan Esports VOD channel, because it would have been pretty difficult to kind of guess what form some of these players are in. It's still pretty difficult to guess what form some of these players are in, but it's definitely a little bit easier now, and that's why they come in at number 8. They would be number 10 if I just had no clue what their form looked like, but, Perry is a player that I have to bring up because, again, I was really going to bat for this guy in 2023, even at the beginning of 2024 when he was with Disguised. This was a conversation I was having where I was like, LTA teams, LCS teams at the time should be looking at Perry as a pickup, as a starting jungler in Tier 1. He was a guy who I was giving MVP votes to, I think third place MVP in 2023. He was really kind of a driving carry on a Cincinnati Fear team that ended up top 3, I want to say, maybe top 4. It was one of those two in the NACL. Like, this was a guy who was really looking like he was on the trajectory to be an elite pro, and then he has a little bit of a down split on Disguise. Things don't quite go according to plan. He's really good in the playoffs, which people forget, for that team, but he ends up going full on into content creation. It's been super successful for him, obviously, congratulations, but if he can recap any of that form that he had, like, he was a top 1 or 2 jungler at times in the NACL. Like, there's no reason to believe that that is just entirely gone from him as a player. I do have to rank him a bit conservatively because, again, he's just not played pro in quite a bit of time, and so the junglers that have been good at this level just kind of by de facto need to be ranked above him until he proves he's back in terms of that playing style and that playing form. But, outside of that, Perry looked like Perry's the kind of player that if he came in and was really good for the team, I wouldn't really be all that surprised, and I think that there is a lot to like there. You have Cat Evolved coming in and playing mid lane. This is maybe the ranking people are going to get upset with because he is coming in as my number 9 mid laner, but again, reminder, mid lane in the NACL is pretty good. Like, there are a lot of players that have had ample time at the tier 2 level, and quite frankly, Cat Evolved has not played competitive since 2020, since he was in the TSM system, and, even then, like, there were some, playstyle concerns. Like, I don't know, like, is this guy gonna be good? Is he gonna be bad? I have no clue. Like, he looks good in scrims. I think there's a reason to believe that as a laner, he's gonna actually be pretty strong when it comes to this level, and he can keep up with a lot of the other mid laners mechanically. We already knew that, but in terms of, like, exactly what the output's going to be, whether or not, like, you can expect him to shove and roam. If Perry wants to play a lot more aggressive, are they going to be able to unlock that mode? Is, Cat Evolved going to be able to play a lot more passive? Like, it's just something that we're going to need to see. There are question marks there. And then you've got the bot lane. You want to talk about question marks. Like, Viper has played so little AD carry in his career that it was almost difficult for me to form an opinion on him at all. Not the last player in this video that we'll talk about role swapping and me not really having any tape to evaluate what they're going to look like there, but Viper's a former LCS Rookie of the Year in the top lane. Now, he was also, I believe, the only rookie to get considerable playing time that split, but, like, Viper's a player that's had success in a lot of different ways. The only AD carry tape I could find from an actual non-scrim competitive setting was when he filled in for 100 Thieves Challengers, I want to say 2023. It could be 2022, somewhere around that time, where he filled in for Unforgiven before he got his visa and came in that year, the Unforgiven year. Viper was just, like, and he was fine. He was good. He was okay in that role. He looks okay in terms of their scrims. What do I expect from him? I have no clue. And you could say the same thing for Stunt. The last time we saw him play, like, true competitive League of Legends where he was, like, near the top level, he was playing in LCS, 400 Thieves, and it's just so difficult to look back at 2020 and say, like, well, that's the form he's gonna have bringing into 2025. Like, it's just such a different game. Again, there are scrims to go off of, but scrims can also be deceiving, and I don't want to put all of the stock into that. All of this to take away and say, like, okay, Conviction's a team that content-wise is going to be super entertaining to watch. I'm really excited to see what they post. It seems like they are going to be very forthcoming about a lot of their, actual games and scrims and content. If they're going to stream every single scrim, if they're going to stream games that they play in the NACL, if they're just going to be like a more active version of what Near Airport was as a content org, and perhaps, they're going to make playoffs and, kind of compete in that setting, that's going to be a huge win for the league as a whole. But I think there's also a downside here where they could just be bad. Like, these are a bunch of players who have not played competitive in a long time. And, all due respect to, players like, Perry and Viper and Stunt and Evolved, Cat Evolved, like, all due respect to them, they're very good players. Like, they don't have the track record that Pobelter and Double Lift and Biofrost did coming out of retirement to basically, play back in competitive again. Like, they don't have that same kind of actual, pro experience that those players had. And so it's difficult to project where this team is going going to land. Right now, I just can't justify putting them above number 8 because of the other teams that are around this station, but they could be number 10, they could be number 3, and I think anywhere in between, I would kind of expect them to land. Then moving on to number 7 in my power rankings, and this is where I think it really starts to be like, I think these teams' floors are just a little bit higher. Not to say I can't see any of the teams in the bottom 3 breaking through, just that I think they have the most question marks. They're the ones with glaring question marks going into the split that they could overcome, they could not, I don't know. The next grouping of teams, I would specifically say 5, 6, and 7 are pretty similar in terms of where I expect them, and it's all just really about who you trust the most. But coming in at number 7 for me, it's going to be CCG Esports. This is a team that obviously overperformed, quote unquote, for a lot of people in the spring split. Not for me. I had them at number 5 in my pre-split power rankings going into that spring split, and they ended up just around there, like around 5, around 6, you know, in that same spot with Winthrop and with Conviction, at least in the regular season. And they make some changes going into split 2. Basically, everybody makes changes going into split 2, it would seem, but a couple other players definitely got poached by some other teams, specifically Dardock and Breezy, and it does feel like they need to try and replace them with players that can still compete, and I think they do a pretty good job, but there are definitely still some question marks here. So let's go ahead and talk about it. Their lineup is looking like Crimson in the top lane, Music in the jungle, Young in the mid lane, Shogo at AD carry, and Fadachan at support. Obviously, varying mixes of experience at this level. Most of these players have a pretty decent amount of experience, either just being really good at tier 2 or being great at tier 3, which is a very good sign. I think you're specifically looking, you know, at players like Music and Young that have had a lot of success at this level in the past. And obviously Crimson, you know, has played a lot for CCG. He's kind of been the franchise player for this organization over the past couple of years. This bot lane, I think, has a ton of upside if everything were to pan out. But there are question marks about what the floor looks like for a team like this, which is, again, why they end up coming in just outside of the top 6 for me, although I do think it's relatively close. Let's talk about the one player actually returning from last split, that being Crimson. On the top side, he definitely seems like the one player that this team wants to continue to push for, and I do kind of understand why. I've never been blown away by Crimson's ability on the top side of the map. I think he's a good player. I haven't seen like the flashes of greatness that I think I've been waiting for to really believe that he can be a top-tier top laner at this level, but I was kind of saying similar things about Zamudo for a lot of his time when he was on lower tier teams in tier 2 as well, and so you never really know when a breakout's going to come, when a, you know, specific team environment is going to be able to elevate a player to their best self and kind of teach them how to play at their optimal level. You never really know when that's going to happen. I just don't know if Crimson's going to be that guy for CCG, right? Like, I think he's going to be a good top laner in a group of top laners that are pretty inconsistent. He's going to have good games, he's going to have bad games. There are going to be games where he's irrelevant, some games where he's very valuable on the top side. Just kind of your stereotypical good but not great right now kind of top laner. Again, I do think there is mechanical upside here because he is a very good laner, at least all things considered, but we just haven't seen him put it all together for an entire split just yet, and we're still waiting on that. If it can happen, that's great. If it can't happen, that's a bit unfortunate, but everybody else in this team is new. They are basically going with an entirely new set of players. Music is going to be the next player I talk about here in the jungle. Music obviously coming over from a couple of splits on Blue Otter, where he was pretty successful. I mean, last split obviously was a bit of a disaster for Otter. They never really were able to find their footing. They definitely couldn't replicate the kinds of ways that they won in 2024, and I think that there was reason to expect that regression. I think that there were players on that team that definitely overperformed, and Music was one of them. And you know, I don't want to sit here and like lambast Music. He still comes in as my number 5 jungler at this level, and I think he could still be very successful here, but what my problem with Music always was really just felt like for a late game shot calling, you know, macro oriented type of player, which is what Music is, a very loud voice, somebody who is going to be very, you know, macro focused in terms of the way he plays the game. You know, for that style, man, did his teams throw a lot of leads in the late game. Like, the late games were just not consistent, and that carried over into Blue Otter at the beginning of this year. That's something he absolutely has to clean up. I think his early games are still pretty solid, and he is a good team fighter. It just really does feel like gold leads are never safe, and maybe it was a Blue Otter thing, maybe it was a Music thing. We're gonna have to see as these two separate, but for now, it definitely is still a concern for me. I've always been a bit lower on what Music's like current ability is. Hopefully he's able to figure it out, because I think he's a very important piece towards CCG this split, as is Young coming in here in the mid lane. Obviously, Young is kind of an interesting player to talk about. Didn't play in the spring split at the very least. Looked like he was going to be a part of some content teams. Ended up backing out of that. Wasn't sure if he was going to come back to pro play, but there's been a lot of talks. Like Disguised considered bringing him in the LTA. It was somebody that they at least thought about starting in the mid lane spot. He ends up landing a job here for CCG. I think this is an upgrade. Credit to Aljun. I thought he did fine in terms of his rookie split, but there were a lot of moments, especially against top tier teams, where he just looked like he wasn't good enough to be able to elevate this team further. He was going to kind of put a ceiling on what this team could be. Now, maybe he continues to develop in the future, but it didn't really feel like he was a complete tier 2 product yet. I think Young is going to offer a lot more stability in the mid lane. At one point, Young was really looked at as like a top tier mid lane prospect in North America. I think specifically going back to the Golden Guardians days where it was like, wow, there's a lot to like here. He even spent some time playing for Golden Guardians because, somebody needed a visa. I can't even remember who it was at that point, but somebody needed a visa. And so he spent some time in the LCS actually getting some reps, which is really cool. But, it's really down to his championship with Disguised and kind of his long-term success with that organization that, really kept his stock elevated, even when there were times with that organization where he was just an okay mid laner, where he didn't really feel like a top 2, top 3 guy. And that's why he still comes in at number 5. First off, obviously we haven't seen him this year, but even the last time we saw him, I wouldn't say he was playing the best league he's ever played. And so I do need to see a bit more of a consistent version of Young before I just completely throw him back up into the upper echelon. But, spoiler alert, there is kind of a top 4 in terms of mid laners in the NACL. Young is probably the best of the rest in terms of my expectation just outside of that. And maybe he even is in that grouping of B+, A- type of players at the top of the rankings. It's just kind of to be determined. And then you've got the bot lane here. You've got Shogo coming over, of course, from Supernova and from Ole Miss. Shogo was looked at by me and by a lot of people as really the big AD carry prospect of this year, right? Levitate coming in last year, I think was really exciting. Players like, Chrome have really, been grinding it out for a long time and have had a lot of upside. Sajed obviously came in last year as well. Shogo was the one player that we were looking at this year, kind of talking about potential crazy upside for, and it just didn't really click for Supernova in split 1 in the spring split. I think that there were some things that were for him and some that were against him. The major criticism I gave Shogo was that the difference between him on these super hyper carries like Jinx and Zeri and Aphelios versus him on almost anything else is pretty noticeable. He's very good at that style of being a very resource-heavy, hyper carry-esque late-game AD carry where he needs to teamfight, but it just didn't look quite as dominant in other situations, and teams really started taking advantage of that in terms of the bot lane 2v2, where he could fall behind gold in gold really consistently. It wasn't something that was ideal, we'll just say, for Shogo. But on top of that, I do think that the rest of the team also really underperformed. I talked a lot about this over the course of the split. Mid-jungle was not good for that team. Keel had a lot of issues. I just don't think he ever really played up to his own standards. I think he's still a very good player, but it was clear that he wasn't quite the same player that he was on Wildcard and on Team Liquid and, on those other teams in the past. And I think you can talk about Asyla, just not really ever clicking at the tier 2 level. Shogo had a lot of responsibility to carry those games basically on his own. And even then, players like Rhino, who were really good in tier 3 and had a lot of success, I don't know if they had a ton of success in tier 2 or were particularly consistent. I think Shogo was not necessarily surrounded by the most dominant talent. I understand why CCG feels comfortable picking him up to come in and play AD carry. I will say, at least in the short term, you have to imagine this is a slight downgrade to someone in Array who was really good last split, who's been very consistent over the course of his entire career, but Shogo certainly has more upside in terms of what he can become because we know he can be the kind of player that elevates a team if everything were to click. And then you've got Fadachan in the support position. Now, he's coming in at number 10, and that feels really disrespectful because, from a production standpoint, you could argue he was the most valuable player in the entirety of the promotion tournament, but he did that as an AD carry, and he's played his entire career as an AD carry. I have no idea what this guy looks like as a support. I have no idea if he's going to be able to function or play well in that role. I think it's very possible. He's got a lot of really nice instincts. I think his team fighting in the promotion tournament for Dorado was incredibly encouraging, but again, I don't know what this guy looks like as a support. I can't put him above number 10. I've never seen a single game of him playing this position. And so, for now, he has to come in at number 10. Again, maybe he just ends up figuring it out. This was a guy that I was really excited to talk about because of just how well he played for Dorado. And, I was going to really hype up that team. Not to say that I think less of Dorado now that they have Sushi instead of Fadachan, but it is one of those things where, whatever you get out of him, clearly they saw something in their scrims that they felt good about going with the Shogo Fadachan bot lane, but I can't really endorse that until I actually see it on the Rift. So for now, he ends up at number 10, and that means that their floor is lower. You can still see there's a lot of things that could go wrong for this team. I'm not really all in on anybody on this team. I think there are some real question marks. Crimson's a player who's been good, but maybe not great at this level. He's certainly not been consistent. Music, I've always had, just outside of that upper echelon of junglers at this level, and, I think he could rise back into that conversation, or, outside of the Blue Otter system, he could fall. I think that that's also possible. Young didn't even play last split, and while I do like his playstyle as a mid laner, and I think he's probably the player I feel the best about on this team, I'm not sold that he's going to be entirely locked in here. You have Shogo, who I had incredibly high hopes for, but also was a bit disappointed by his showing in the spring split. And Fadachan, like I said, who's never played the position that, he's playing this split in an actual stage game before, whether that's in Europe and Turkey or whether that's here. It's never been that. So I have no idea what to expect from CCG. I think it's really all over the place in terms of, what you can think this team will be, but unfortunately that just leads slightly outside of the top 6. Even if I think they have the upside to drastically outperform that if everything hits. Then moving on to number 6 in my power rankings, and I know top 6 doesn't matter as much. I believe top 8 end up making quote-unquote playoffs in the NACL, but top 6 is still an accomplishment, and coming in at number 6 for me, it is going to be Blue Otter. And obviously there is a lot to talk about when it comes to this team because they underperformed a lot of people's expectations in spring. This was my number, I think, 4 team in the NACL going into 2025, and they end up being just outside of the relegation zone, at least to go down into the promotion tournament. So, obviously they're going to be happy that I think they upgraded their roster and that I think they're looking at a higher upside team in general, but there still is a lot of things that this team needs to prove from a macro sense for me to really believe that they're just going to fix everything going in to Summer Split. So let's go ahead and talk about it. Their lineup is looking like Quacker in the top lane, Low Jazz in the jungle, Samakin in the mid lane, Chrome and AD carry, and Rovex at support. The good thing for Blue Otter is that they still are loaded with talent. They still have a ton of players that have a ridiculous amount of upside, and I would argue that your ceiling just went through the roof, like in terms of the 2 new players that you brought in for this split, and the players that are staying are players that I feel pretty good about, all things considered. At the very least, we kind of know what they are as players, but the upside of especially Chrome coming in here is absolutely massive, coming off of a really phenomenal split with conviction. So I'm really excited to talk about that, but let's get to the players that are staying first and foremost. Kind of the players that I, kind of feel good talking about in terms of what they are. I think we'll start with the solo laners here. Quacker and Samakin are going to be the first 2 we talk about. Quacker is exactly who he has been his entire career, and that's a bit unfortunate for me because there was a time period where I was like, man, this guy's going to be the next breakthrough top laner. I even thought at the beginning of this year, like, oh, this could be his year to really cement himself as like a top 3, top 4 top laner in the league, somebody that can actively really push for upper tier spots. It's just never really been consistent enough. The bad games are just always there, and I think that that's the frustrating part, is the good games look absolutely tremendous, and even if the good games looked worse in the spring split than they had previously, they still were there. You were still seeing moments where he was generating big leads and counter picks on the top side, but the problem is when he gets counterpicked or when he just loses early on in the game in the 1v1 or when he's down in resources, man, his games can spiral out of control really fast. And again, we know a lot of top laners at this level are kind of like that. We just talked about it a bit with Crimson. I think Quacker takes it a bit more extreme, but Quacker reminds me of someone like Zamudo, obviously, who I've talked about previously, where you saw him on these weaker teams previously and he just wasn't really able to find any consistency ever, but then you get him onto stronger teams and it figures itself out. It's kind of been, I don't want to say the opposite for Quacker, but like when I'm thinking about the Quacker that I thought was going to break through and be an upper echelon top laner, I'm thinking about the one that was like stuck on bottom tier teams and getting all the resources and really popping off, where on Blue Otter, it just more so feels like he's fallen into the structure. And while that might be good for Otter in particular, I just don't know if that gives him the upside that I was expecting to see out of him 2 years ago when he was coming out of like the wild card and the Supernova, experiences. But, Quacker's still very good. Like, I don't want to try and make it seem like he's bad. He's just not that top 3 top laner that I think he could have been at the start of the year. Same thing for Samakin, although a little bit different. Samakin's just your super stable, very good, like, mid laner. I feel very good about what Samakin is as a player. He's kind of against the grain in terms of what a lot of players at this level like to play. He's not the most aggressive mid laner in the world, although he can be aggressive. He's definitely much more the control mage, like burst mage type of player, and I think that does fit what Blue Otter want to play, and I think generally Samakin has just been good for this team. Does he still have elite upside? I think it's there. I think that there is a potential for him to break out and still be an elite level prospect. I just have a harder time seeing it now that mid lane has gotten better going into summer. You know, I think if he was going to break out as like an elite level mid laner again, it probably would have happened in the spring split, but maybe he's learned and grown. And again, maybe the macro of this team is entirely different and he's actually going to receive a lot more resources going in to the summer split. That could potentially unlock him a bit more. I don't expect that to happen. I think the big positive of having someone like Samikin is he can help facilitate a lot of the other players on the team, whether that be jungle or specifically bot lane, like he did last year for Levitate. And I think that is kind of the big hope here for Samikin, but you know, for the most part, I think he's just a super stable, super good mid laner that you're going to feel good about. He's not really going to blow the doors off of the place, but I think he's going to be an upper mid-table kind of mid laner. And that's when you start to get to everyone else. We'll start with the bot lane here. Rovx obviously returning. I always have liked Rovx. In fact, I loved his 2024. I thought he was breaking out as one of the best supports in North America in terms of a prospect and the potential that he showed. Didn't quite click. Levitate certainly did not follow up his 2024 with a great start to 2025. Rovx was making quite a lot of mistakes individually as well, but I think the potential is still there. I think when you're talking about the three players that remained between Quacker, Samikin, and Rovx, Rovx is probably the one player that I would expect to still have that upside to potentially be a top 2 or top 3 in his role in the NACL. And if that happens and you brought in Chrome, who already is a top 380 carry, like you're looking at one of the best bot lanes in the entire league. And that's really the upside here for Blue Otter. You know, Chrome coming in, that's an absolutely massive get. You know, Conviction ends up tearing down their team. I'm not sure if they're the ones that made that decision or if they just made that decision after players like Chrome and Darkwings ended up going elsewhere. But this was a guy who was one game away from making the finals, and he was the best player on that team. He was the reason that they were clicking. This guy at an absolute top end level can be an AD carry that plays in the LTA like very soon. His mechanics are ridiculous. His ability to carry games is ridiculous. The only reason that I wasn't singing his praises before 2025 as much is because Levitate on this team I thought was just slightly flashier in 2024, but go back and watch my summer split analysis for the NACL in 2024. The two players I was hyping up the most were Levitate and Aaron, and now we're sitting here with Chrome, Aaron coming in to replace Levitate. So obviously I have really high expectations of this bot lane. I think Rovx is going to get back on track. I think Chrome is still going to be an elite AD carry like he kind of has been everywhere he's gone, and I think this is going to turn into one of the best bot lanes in the entire league, which just elevates what this team can be, and it's why I feel very confident, you know, projecting them to be in the top 6. I would be very surprised if things don't click in the way that I'm expecting with these two bot lane players. But then you get to talk about low jazz in the jungle, and this is where it does get a bit dicier. This is definitely much more of a punt. I know that originally this spot was supposed to be Keel, and obviously that probably would have been a bit better for this team in terms of just the floor. Keel's upside is really high. We know that, like the off-meta picks, the Nunu, the Karthus, all of that stuff had been shown in the past, but he wasn't really all that good in the spring split. And so, you know, bringing in someone like low jazz that, again, also has really high mechanical upside could actually be more of a boon in the long run. I'm not guaranteeing that that's going to be the case, but I do think it's possible that we're looking at low jazz, who is a carry-oriented jungler. We saw a lot of him out of AMI over this past split, that this could actually be a positive move. The problem is I just have no clue if that's going to be their day one. I think right now I have pretty low expectations for low jazz. I think this is a player that, while he does have really high highs, has really, really low lows. And I think for a jungler, that can be pretty punishing. I think if Samikin can stabilize in the mid lane and really kind of help out low jazz in terms of being able to get through a lot of the early games, which he sometimes struggled with when he was on AMI, I think things are going to be fine, especially if this bot lane is just constantly in winning positions, which is certainly not out of the realm of possibility. I think low jazz is going to have an easier time playing the game. But if you want a reason to be a bit more like, on Blue Otter, I think low jazz is not exactly the most dominant jungler, and I'm not really expecting the floor for him as a player to be particularly high. And I think you could say the same thing, like Quacker's floor, relatively low. Rovex's floor can sometimes be relatively low in terms of a game-to-game basis. So Otter could burn out, but the reason they're above CCG and certainly above the bottom 3 in terms of their floor rankings is just the consistency of Samikin and Chrome, I think, are better than anything that anybody else that we've talked about up until this point has. And I think Rovx is going to be great. I think this bot lane is going to be really strong. I would be surprised if they ended up being like anything other than a top 3 bot lane in the NACL, to be entirely frank with you. And then if low jazz can start coming along, if he can just play his role on this team, essentially be what Music was, except maybe without the bad late games, like if that's going to be the case, then like Blue Otter can actually be top 4, top 5, like can start to enter themselves into that conversation, basically the exact same way that Conviction did in the spring split playing through Chrome. I think there are more obstacles in the way for Blue Otter than there were for Conviction from my perspective, but it's definitely still possible. But then moving on to number 5 in my power rankings, and this is kind of a feel-good story from the spring split in terms of how this team ended up performing. It is Winthrop University, and honestly, despite the fact that their player grades come in, and you can see that this team is probably below the last 2 teams we talked about in terms of my expectations, I just couldn't put them anywhere below number 5. I had to give them the benefit of the doubt, not only because they performed really well in the spring split, but because they're one of only 2 teams in the NACL that are running back all 5 members from the previous split. That's a big boost at the beginning of the year in terms of cohesion, and quite frankly, we've seen this in other regions, maybe not so much in Tier 2, but definitely in a lot of Tier 1 regions where rosters that stay together inherently just do better, especially if they were already good to begin with. So, you know, I feel pretty good about Winthrop going into this split, even if it doesn't necessarily show it in terms of these player grades. But let's go ahead and talk about it. Their lineup is looking like Denethor in the top lane, Wilson in the jungle, Sword in the mid lane, Mobility at AD carry, and only 35 at support. Of course, a lot of really good talent here, but a lot of players that I think played really well last split. 2 in particular that I really want to highlight that I think played really well in spring, and you could potentially see another leap, I would say, from one of them going into summer. And of course, it's the main guy on this team. It's Mobility in the bot lane. He is the main character for Winthrop in terms of how they like to play the game. I think a lot of people were looking at the 2 collegiate teams coming in, or I guess 2 of the 3 collegiate teams coming into this year, and looking at Mobility and Shogo as 2 players to really watch out for. But Shogo was the one that was receiving a lot of eyes, I think, from me and from other analysts as well. I thought he was more productive on his own in Tier 3, and I thought his upside was a little bit higher, but boy, were we proven wrong there, because Mobility was just straight up better in his first split in Tier 2, and Mobility was good enough to be able to, quite frankly, consistently outduel players like Doublelift and be able to win playoff series against them, which is gigantic. If Mobility is going to be the kind of player that has the upside to be top 2 or top 3, very similar to how we talked about someone like Sushi, or how, you know, Shogo could theoretically be for CCG, if that's the kind of player that you're getting here in Mobility, then yeah, this team more than deserves to be at number 5, because you have like a true carry, you have a true ace on this team if you do end up getting that version of him. I do think there were some, you know, growing pains that were there in the spring split. I don't think it was all perfect. I think there were quite a few games where the bot lane just didn't get ahead and the team instantly lost. I think what we found out pretty consistently is that if the bot lane is losing for Winthrop, it's going to be tough for them to win games, and if bot lanes are going to get better going into this split, that's going to be a bit of a problem for Winthrop to be able to match. But if Mobility and Only 35 can continue to grow as a duo, that's big. Now, Only 35 I had really high hopes for going into the split, or going into last split. I had him as the best player on this team. I really did believe that he was going to be kind of the anchor for what they were doing, not only because of his, you know, time on previous organizations, but from what I saw from him at the beginning of the year in CLOL, I really thought that he was going to be the driving force for what Winthrop was doing. Didn't really happen in the NACL. He had a couple of nice games, and again, like, playing off of Mobility is so big towards what Winthrop do, and so his laning phase mattered a lot, and for the most part, he did come through when it mattered the most. Again, especially against Near Airport in those 2 series that people are going to remember, both from the end of the regular season and from the round 1 of the playoffs. But outside of that, I do think that there were some concerning games in there as well, some feast or famine types of performances, and I think I would just like to see him shore that up a little bit. Again, if this bot lane can just get to be like a top 4, which again is pretty realistic in terms of the NACL, I think Winthrop is absolutely going to live up to this top 5 ranking. And then the other player that was really great, which you definitely can't see from their ranking, was Sword in the mid lane, who I thought was actually really good in the spring split, was really impressed with his tape. Unfortunately, mid lane got a ton better going into the summer split as opposed to what it was in the spring split, so somehow, some way, he actually falls in terms of his ranking. He goes down from number 7 in spring to number 8 in summer, even though I feel much better about him now than I did at the beginning of the year. But if he's going to be able to play the way that he did for most of the regular season, like, that was an upper half mid laner in the NACL, and if that's going to be the case, again, that really solidifies this spot, because I do think there are a lot of players that are really trying to reach that specific place, right? Like, he's very close in terms of where I rank him to players like Shochi and Samakin. Like, that's kind of the company that he's keeping, and those are players who have found a ton of success at this level before, who have been able to make deep playoff runs in the NACL. There's no reason to believe that Sword, with the performance that he gave last split, is not able to do that. So again, if mid lane's going to be a positive, and if bot lane's going to be a positive, now you're looking at a map that's actually really consistent. Now, that being said, I'm not super sold on the top side of the map. I still think that they're very good, but I have more question marks. Wilson comes in number 7 for me. me. I think jungle is a weaker position, especially lower on the rankings than mid lane or AD carry is, and so Wilson's 7 is probably weaker than Sword's 8, which I know feels weird to say, but it just kind of is. Wilson just has some games that I'm really not sold on. I think he can still be a valuable jungler here, but it kind of reminds me a lot of how I talked about Winnie for a long time, where it feels like you can generate advantages, like especially playing from ahead, like it feels pretty consistent, but like playing from behind, oftentimes you're looking at why the team is down in resources, and you can see Wilson kind of struggling to be able to keep up in pace. I think he will get better. Again, this was a player that was really kind of flirting with tier 2 for a very long time, so it was nice to see him finally get a shot, and I do think that he helped Sword quite a lot in the mid lane. I just want to see a bit more aggressiveness come out of him going into the summer split. And then Denethor, the one player who actually had like consistent tier 2 experience before the beginning of this year from this Winthrop team last year, he's fine. Again, he's a slightly weaker version of what we've already talked about, in my opinion, with like players like Quacker and players like Crimson, where you can expect good games out of him. And I think we saw, especially when he got on some of those divers, things like Camille on the top side of the map, he definitely felt a lot more comfortable than he did on tanks, but he's not the most versatile player in the world. He's not the most consistent player in the world. There are going to be matchups that he just kind of loses, and I think counterpick actually does matter a lot for him individually as a player, which can pigeonhole you in draft depending on how you want to go. But I think lucky for him, the rest of this team is relatively flexible. But I think if there is a reason to be lower on Winthrop, it's probably Denethor and Wilson on the top side of the map. But Sword, I feel good about. The only concern is that the mid lane pool has gotten better, so maybe his impact on the game is going to be slightly lower. But again, he was a top half mid laner in the spring split. There's really not a ton of reason to believe he can't do that again. You know, mobility, I think, could take even another leap because he was better down the stretch, like at the end of the split, than he was at the beginning of the split. If he continues that growth trajectory, he could be a top 4 AD carry basically from moment one. You have players like Only35 that I think have ridiculously good mechanical upside and were really good going into the year, and I think still could be able to be better than what they were in spring. There's a lot of reason to like Winthrop, and they already were kind of a surprise positive team in the spring split. Hopefully they're able to keep that momentum up. If not, I wouldn't be stunned if this team was closer to 8th, maybe even 9th, like worst case scenario. I think that's possible with the league getting better if, you know, teams like Conviction and Dorado and Vancouver Impact are actually really good, but for now, I have to give them the benefit of the doubt because they're running all 5 back, and I do believe that the last we saw of this team was really good. But that's going to bring us to our top 4 teams, and this is where I think it really starts to separate. Like I said, kind of 3 groupings for me. From number 8 to number 10, I think there are teams that have upside, like actual top 6 upside, but have floors that could be like bottom 1. Then from 7 to 5, I think you're looking at teams that I feel pretty good about not being horrible, like not being 10th, but also could be bad, could still be really good, could break through, kind of like last split. And then for me, top 4 are teams that I feel pretty good about being, you know, actually contenders. Would be surprised if they weren't top 6, but also could be top 1, you know, definitely have the upside to be able to figure something out. Coming in at the bottom of that for me, just because they have the most to prove, it's going to be Citadel Gaming, the last team to qualify through the promotion tournament, and a team with a lot of players who are very familiar with this level and who have had a ton of success at this level in the past. Of course, they're a bit different, we'll just say, than the other 2 teams, than Dorado and then Vancouver Impact that we've talked about previously, because I just think that their roster is built better for being able to show up day 1 and actually perform at the NACL level. Now, that being said, there are some concerns about whether or not this team has like league winning upside. There was a reason that none of these players had rosters at the beginning of the year, all for different reasons, I would say, not because of their talent level. All of these players are more than good enough, but you know, just kind of ended up that way. And I think for Citadel, it's really about whether or not they can prove that they are like a top 2 or a top 3 team. I think that they have the talent to do so. So let's talk about it. Their lineup is looking like Philip in the top lane, Kenvi in the jungle, Bradley in the mid lane, Instinct at AD carry, and Diamond at support. Of course, as you guys know, I did stream for Citadel at the beginning of the year. I streamed the open qualifiers in the first split. The roster was a bit different, but, you know, I definitely am a little bit biased towards this team. I've tried to be as neutral as possible, but it's worth disclosing that I really want this team to do well. I am pretty in favor of them, and I think they made some good roster decisions going into the summer split. Obviously, Kenvi coming in, you know, Armeo kind of taking a step back from pro play and, you know, wanting to focus more on content creation and just moving things outside of that. And then, of course, Diamond coming in and starting at support is the other major change. But Philip, Bradley, Instinct, they've been there the entirety of this year up until this point, and we've seen this team probably should have been in the NACL in the spring split. The format that they went through was pretty diabolical. They end up getting upset a little bit earlier than maybe they're expecting in the Split 1 tournament and just can't quite get it done in the final series against that team that would eventually become Conviction, which obviously turned out to be pretty good, but they definitely make their way pretty handily, we'll just say, into the NACL this time, a 3-0 against AMI. And you can point to a lot of different players as being the best players in their role in the promotion tournament if you really wanted to go down that route. I think the first player that jumps out to me in terms of just doing really well in the promotion tournament was Bradley, who had an incredibly good promo tournament. And I think Bradley's one of those players that I just feel pretty stable about. Now, the top 3 mid laners in the NACL are really, really good right now and have track records that prove that they can be #1 options on championship winning teams, or at least I believe that that's going to be the case for them. Bradley is a player that at times has looked like a good player on great teams, and I think the question is, can he be a #1 option for a team that wants to push for #1 or #2? I think back to FlyQuest last year, and I'm not blaming FlyQuest's underperformance on him. I certainly don't even believe that to be the case, but he was the kind of player that was brought in to replace Quad, who was a superstar in the mid lane, and he was good, but was he like elite? Was he this A- caliber mid laner? I don't know. I don't know if I saw that last year. I think there were a couple of games that I needed to see a little bit more out of, and I think he's got the opportunity to do that here on Citadel. He has been demolishing people in lane, both in the promotion tournament, like in the open qualifiers previously, in the spring split, and then of course here in the promotion tournament going into summer as well. He's just been the best laner in the mid lane of anybody, and I think that will carry through. Again, hopefully he can step up as a consistent #1 like carry piece in the later part of the game, but as a resource getter, like he's already an elite player, and he's had success at this level. And you want to talk about success at this level, you've got players like Philip and Kenvi on the top side of the map. Philip, obviously, you know, alongside Instinct, playing for that FearX Starforge team last year that was top 2, that ended up winning the Americas tournament and, you know, just being overall really successful there. This was a team that, you know, honestly, these players, there's no justification for them to be teamless going into 2025. Philip is a player who's always succeeded at the NACL level, who's always performed really well. He was even good during his small stint in the LCS for FlyQuest back in the day. You know, I feel pretty good about Philip. Definitely much more of a bruiser kind of player, but can play tanks at a really high level, can play carries as well at a high level if he's asked to do so. Just a very versatile player that I think is good for saving late picks in the draft for, and you know, you can definitely play through him, but, you know, can play any style. Like, you know who Philip is. If you've watched this channel, you know who Philip is as a player, and I think he's a big value to have here. Same thing for Kenvi in the jungle. You might even be upset that I'm putting him too high here because I have him as my #2 jungler, and I don't know if that necessarily showed in the promotion tournament. I think that there were times where you could argue that Will was more dominant against his level of competition, but Kenvi also had a smaller job. Like, Will had to really carry that team at times, Jolly Rogers, in that promotion tournament, where Kenvi was a part of this big machine that could kind of generate their own tempo. But I was such a Kenvi fan last year. I thought it was absolutely ridiculous how people were talking about him. I really didn't see a lot of the negatives that people were pointing out. I do think it got a little bit worse going into summer split. Like, was he quite as dominant in summer as he was in spring for Supernova? Probably not, but like, was Kenvi still really, really good for that team? Yes. Like, you could make an argument that he was clearly a top 3 jungler in the NACL last year. Obviously, he's the one member of this team who was supposed to be a part of Nightmare going into the year, and then that entire thing just ends up not working out. But, you know, Kenvi's the kind of player where if he came back into the league with Citadel and immediately became an MVP candidate, I'm really not going to be all that surprised, and you probably shouldn't be surprised either. And then Instinct and Diamond in the bot lane. Instinct is a really stable player. I love his ability to team fight in the later part of games. I think that's really his superpower as a player. He can be a very stable laner, but I think he's just one of those players that doesn't need a ton of resources in order to be useful, but can really be in a position where he can take over games. And we saw last year when they did need to rely on him a bit more, FearX Starforge that is, when they needed to rely on him to carry games, he absolutely could do that. He could be the kind of player to step up. I just think in an environment where he doesn't have to be the #1 option, he can still really be a big problem. His team fighting is, again, elite. I think if his laning can come around, he can still be an upper tier AD carry. There are some really good ADCs. Like, the top 4 ADCs are really, really good. Spoiler alert, again, for the list. I'm sorry if you don't like spoilers, but he's coming in just below players like Sajed and Chrome, and like, those players are just really good. Like, it's hard for me to rank Instinct above those guys, but he is still a very valuable AD carry, and I think he's an asset here. And Diamond has only looked good at this level. Like, I get that people get frustrated because Diamond was maybe not the perfect LCS support when he was playing for teams like Dignitas and FlyQuest. He never really had like good tenures in tier 1, but let's not pretend like this guy has not consistently been able to be at the top of tier 2, not only in terms of production, but in terms of like actual results, like being on teams that are winning. You know, Diamond was someone I pushed for pretty heavily at the beginning of the year, and I do think that he can come in and still be an upper tier support at this level. Him and Instinct can be a very good bot lane. The only question for Citadel is just like, what kind of form is this team going to be in as a team? We saw them them do really well this split in particular in the promotion tournament. They really handled AMI, who was a competitive team in the NACL last year, but, you know, this was a team that tried to qualify in the spring split and weren't quite able to get there. There are some concerns about whether or not this team can elevate to be top 1 or top 2, but I really do believe they have that kind of upside. For now, I do have to put them below the top 3 because I think top 3 just are terrifying. The rosters at the top of the NACL got very scary going into summer looking for that promotion spot, but if Citadel are close or even at the top of the standings by the midway point or by the end of the split, I'm really not going to be all that surprised. But now we get into my top 3 teams, and number 3 was pretty tough, man. There are some difficult decisions at the top of the standings here in the NACL, but coming in at number 3, it's gonna be DarkZero, a team that I had a number 1 at the start of the year that I think pretty much everybody had near the upper echelon at the start of the year, and I looked pretty smart for doing that because a lot of people had Luminosity at number 1 for a majority of the preseason. I had DarkZero there. Eventually, UG gets poached. Finally, it took him long enough to get to tier 1, and yeah, DarkZero wasn't quite on the same level as Luminosity after UG left. I think we could all kind of expect that to happen, but this team did a pretty decent job of rebounding and certainly made some interesting roster decisions going in to the summer split that I'm very intrigued to talk about because this is not the team that I thought we were going to be looking at for DarkZero going into summer, but let's talk about it. Their lineup is looking like KE, I believe is how you say it. Like KE, again, like let me know in the comments section because I have looked everywhere for a video where anyone on his team says his name and I just can't really find it anywhere. So I'm going to call him KE for the portion of this video that I talk about him, but let me know if that's correct or incorrect. Kizno in the jungle, Toasty in the mid lane, Sajed at AD carry, and Zyko at support. Of course, you know, I guess 2.5 members of this team returning from last split. Sajed and Zyko really the only 2 main starters that are returning from DarkZero last split, but what good starters to bring back. Certainly the players that you would want to see here for them. Sajed was excellent. I really do think he had probably his best split ever in the NACL at the very least last split for DarkZero. I think that there were a lot of times where they actually relied on him to carry games in the back half, which is something that FlyQuest basically never did. I get that he was probably more successful, especially in spring on FlyQuest last year, but it was a different circumstance. This was a team that still had high expectations, but really wanted to play through bot lane a lot more. And I think Sajed finally stepped up and showed that he's like right now one of the better carries. He's not like a B plus caliber player. He can really elevate a team. And unfortunately, AD carries are just really good at this level. Again, he comes in right below Chrome. And so I'm not trying to sit here and say that he's a really bad player. I think mechanically there are some things that need to be not cleaned up, but just like worked on a tad bit. You know, Chrome I think was just a little bit better in that regard, but Sajed still is an incredible player. And I think if he ended up being a number 1 or number 2 AD carry by the end of the year, I'm really not going to be all that surprised. And that's also because he's playing with Zyko in the support position. You guys know how much I love Zyko. I've been pretty vocal about that on this channel. I'm honestly really frustrated that he's still playing in the NACL. Obviously, his teammate Scary Jerry kind of got screwed over in the LTA, so maybe it's for the best that he didn't actually join him on Disguised in terms of how things worked out. But Zyko's a player I really believe in. I still think he does basically everything at a really high level. This guy is just a phenomenal support. Whether you want to put him on engaged supports or, you know, enchanters, it doesn't really matter. He's just an elite player and he's always going to be in the right position. He has a really great macro mind on him. You know, he's not the most, like, mechanically dominant support you've ever seen in the entire world, but this is a guy who's pretty much always going to be elevating the team around him, and that's why I think this bot lane is considered so good for me, and Zyko coming in as the number 1 support is a big boon for why DarkZero is still in the top 3 in terms of the standings, because there are some questions elsewhere on this roster. The 2.5, the half, I guess, that I was talking about there is Toasty, kind of returning, coming back as a full-time starter here in the mid lane. Spyrax is out, Toasty looks like he is in, and honestly, I kind of like this decision, all due respect to Spyrax. I think Spyrax arguably also had his most dominant split this last split in the spring. I really do believe he really was incredible as a carry. Finally stepped up, and especially without UG there, and once UG left, he kind of could show that he could be the big, like, team fight carry for this team, which he never really had to be because UG and Zamudo and Scary Jerry and all of these players that he's gotten to play with, because they were always so aggressive. I had kind of pigeonholed Spyrax into this idea of like he's the perfect shove and roam mid laner. He can play that style where he plays for jungle and he plays for bot lane and he plays to get his team ahead, right? Like, you know, that was kind of the narrative on him, but he showed that he's a lot more than that in the spring split. But Toasty Alex, man, like, I am ready for this guy to ascend to stardom. He was getting a real look for DSG as as their starting mid laner. In fact, I'm not trying to spoil anything. I think LCS EV actually reported this, but I believe he was the number one option in the mid lane for Disguised, and he just didn't want to leave DarkZero. I think DarkZero didn't want to sell, or the buyout was too high, or something along those lines, because Toasty really was supposed to be in the LTA, and that's the kind of talent this guy has. He has always been successful so far in the NACL. He joins Fear, and honestly, I was pretty up and down by the decision for Fear to replace Shochi with Toasty, because I was just like, Shochi worked really well for the team, and Toasty's this inexperienced player. He was incredible, probably the best first split player that split in the NACL. He then replaces Shochi once again, unfortunately, when he goes to Supernova, and is once again incredible for that team, really cementing himself as one of the better mid laners in the entire league. And then this year happens, and everything just kind of falls apart a bit. He gets picked up very early on by Maryville, but is supposed to be playing for Pulse, and the whole Pulse thing falls through, so he's kind of just a backup for Maryville, and that's not an ideal place to play. He barely played at all in the spring split. I still believe Toasty is going to be an elite mid laner at this level, and honestly, if he's number one by the end of the first couple weeks, I'm not going to be that surprised. I think mechanically speaking and upside-wise, he is the player that I'm kind of hitching my wagon to, as the player I expect to next break out in the NACL. I think he's the next, Surdy, Scary Jerry, whatever you want to say, Zamudo, the next player that's just oh, you have to go up, you have to be an LTA player. We'll see if I'm right or wrong on that. His floor is just a tad bit lower than the top two who have done it very consistently, but Toasty's a great player, and I think I'm very excited to see him finally get a full-time starting spot, presuming he actually does start full-time here for DarkZero. But it's the top side of the map that is brand new, that is definitely a lot more interesting to talk about. Now, Kisno is coming over, of course, the jungler for Conviction this past split. Kisno really impressed me in terms of how he played the map, is clearly an upper half jungler at the NACL level. Now, the question is going to be, is he going to be an elite jungler at this level? That's the kind of next step that he would have to take. A lot of junglers have really struggled to consistently be able to get into that next step. They're very good at proving, yeah, we can survive at this level, we can be good junglers, but also, a lot of those same junglers have struggled to be I can become the top 1 or top 2 jungler at this level. And I do think that there is some reason to be, skeptical of this signing. Not because I think Kisno's a bad player, but because I'm the biggest Kryra stan in the entire universe. I was really excited to see this guy potentially get a full run as the starting jungler. Even Shimmer, I think, showed some interesting things for this team, but Kryra was really the one that I was excited to see, and Kisno coming in kind of offers a higher floor, but potentially a lower ceiling in terms of how this team ends up working. I still understand why they ended up making the decision, and maybe I'm entirely wrong on this. Maybe Kisno's ceiling is actually crazy high, and maybe he's the type of player that really can emerge as a top 1 or top 2 jungler. For now, he just came off his best split ever in the NACL, and if that arrow is going to continue to point up, then this is a good signing. And if he can break into that top 2, top 3, it's a great signing. But I do kind of need to see that happen before I'm just fully all in on this decision, because Kryra Toasty as a mid-jungle duo was something I was really excited to see. And then you've got Kei on the top side, and again, this is the last player to talk about. For those of you who are unfamiliar with who this is, I don't blame you. He was playing in the LRN, the Latin America North league that I guess still exists to try and qualify and promote people, I believe, into the spot to that Lion is currently representing in the LTA. I could be wrong about that. It could be LRN tier 2 or something like that, but he was playing for Zeus, and honestly, I was really impressed with his tape. This guy was really dominant in terms of his ability to play top lane. Now, was he the main guy for his team? Definitely not. His mid laner was cracked and was the one receiving a lot of resources, and obviously that makes it a bit more difficult to kind of scout and, figure out where exactly he's going to land. But clearly, DarkZero have a lot of trust in this guy, because not only are they bringing him in to replace Zamudo, who is hard to replace, we'll just say the mechanical talent of Zamudo is unmatched, and having that kind of pressure on the top side is going to be very difficult to deal with, but you already have tenacity here as a top laner, and you feel like KE coming in is going to be the better top lane player for this team, which I just, it's a lot of confidence in a player like that, because Tenacity's not only been successful in tier 2 basically every stop he's been on, but he was fine in tier 1 as well when he was playing for 100 Thieves, and so this is clearly a big vote of confidence for KE, and I hope he's going to be able to live up to it. For now, I'm excited to see he's a carry-oriented player. He's going to be able to fill that Zamudo role, but again, he's going to have to translate from what is, in my opinion, a lower level of competition in the LRN to be able to succeed near the top of the standings in the NACL, and I just don't know if that's going to be exactly perfect. It's the reason this team falls out of the top 2 for me. I was really surprised when I ended up landing on them coming in 3rd, because I never really felt like there was a world where they felt like lower than 2nd last split, even with the changes, and I love Toasty coming in full-time. I think that could be a big upgrade, but, with Kisno being the starting jungler, which could be great, but also it's you know, is he going to be elite? Is he finally going to be able to turn that corner and become a top 1 or a top 2 guy? And KE, which is like a big, who knows, in the top lane, like there is a world where this team is 4th or 5th or somewhere around there as well. I hope DarkZero is good. I think that there's a lot to build on for this team, but definitely more question marks than they had at the beginning of the year. But that's going to bring us to my number 2 team in the top 2 in my power rankings heading into the summer split. And honestly, I did not expect this team to crack the top 2 after how everything went down in the spring split, but talk about a complete roster overhaul to really elevate them up in the standings. It's Supernova coming in at number 2 for me in terms of my power rankings. What a turnaround for a team that linked up with Ole Miss in the spring split because it didn't really feel like they had the money to bring on a bunch of players. You know, all the reports were that the org was trying to save as much as they could and bringing in Ole Miss, partnering up with a team that already has like funding from Ole Miss and Ole Miss getting a sponsor to be able to play in the NACL. Like it was kind of a good deal for both sides, but you know, that didn't really work out. They were a team that was kind of in danger of being relegated for a majority of the split and really ended up underperforming. So what does Supernova do? They splash the cash, presumably, and bring in a team that very well could compete to win the entire league and to try to promote into the LTA. So let's go ahead and talk about it. Their lineup is looking like Hoarder in the top lane, Dardoch in the jungle, a Blaze Olive in the mid lane, Scary Jerry at AD carry, and Breezy at support. This is obviously a terrifying lineup to just straight up build because there's so much here to talk about, but you know, a couple of players that are either coming over together as a package deal in the case of Dardoch and Breezy, Hoarder, obviously a part of the Conviction split up that kind of separated everybody everywhere else, and a Blaze Olive and Scary Jerry coming from opposite places. ABO not playing, obviously in tier 2 in the spring split, and Scary Jerry in the LTA in the spring split. So a lot to talk about when it comes to these teams. Let's just go top to support. I think it's going to be easiest to kind of describe where Supernova is going, and that starts with Hoarder in the top lane. Ironically enough, this is the player I probably have the least amount of thoughts on. I was really impressed with Hoarder in the spring split. Honestly, he was way better than I was giving him credit for. Even just coming into this split, I clearly just was not giving him enough credit coming out of the actual tournament. And, you know, I was kind of putting him in a cluster with a lot of these other players. He was better than almost every other top laner in the league last split. And honestly, I have no reason to believe that that's going to go anywhere. I did say in my primer going into spring that it's likely that one of the cluster of top laners from like number 4 or 5 down was going to break out. I just had him a little bit too low. He was the top laner that did end up breaking out in that cluster, and I'm excited to see that. I think Supernova is very smart for bringing him in. I was going to get frustrated if he didn't have a team going into the summer split, but good for Hoarder. Everybody on that Conviction team does have a roster outside of Manui, which is ridiculous, and I think it's very stupid. Obviously, I've talked about that before, but at least Hoarder ended up getting a job, but you know, overall the Conviction split up was not so beneficial for everybody. Hoarder ended up getting a pretty good end of the deal for it. The rest of this team is still positive. I know I just said I'll go top to support, but let's talk about Dardoch and Breezy together because they're coming from the same place. They're both coming over from CCG, who they played with in the spring split. These were the two driving forces for why CCG was successful. Breezy was my first team all-pro support, which I know wasn't the most popular opinion in the entire world, but Breezy was so good for CCG. I think it's the best split he's ever played in tier 2, and this guy's been a mainstay in tier 2 for a very long time. Kind of your, I hate to say it, like your 4A kind of player, the player that's been very good in tier 2, but I just had questions about whether or not that would ever translate to tier 1. Pains me to say that as a Sun Devils fan and a former Sun Devils player in Breezy, but that was kind of the thing I always thought of him. And then this year happened, and honestly, like it was a completely new and unlocked version of him. I know that there are a lot more playmaking supports in the meta right now, which are really positive for Breezy. That's his playstyle, but he looked so comfortable on CCG. That bot lane was super consistent. At times during last split was the best bot lane in the NACL. And again, Breezy to me was the most interesting support in the entire league. I'm hopeful that he's going to be able to carry that over. And part of that was Dardoch, who was excellent down the stretch for CCG. In their big games, Dardoch was a huge reason why they found as much success. And you don't need me to tell you the kind of track record that Dardoch has, but talk about a guy who really felt like he was, you know, kind of on the down part of his career where it felt like he was kind of just going to be a good player for tier 2, never someone that really broke through again. He never really found a consistent position between jungle and support. He was kind of oscillating between the two for a very long time. A very good tier 3 player, like a top tier 3 player, and a player that I think could have survived at tier 2. And then again, had the best split he's had in a very long time here on CCG. It's a great time to be a Dardoch fan, and I'm very excited to see if he can translate that that same kind of pressure alongside Breezy to this Supernova team. I think it was very smart of this org to bring both of them in, because I think both of them worked great off of each other, and I think it could be a successful duo once again. But let's talk about the two carries, because this is the real reason for like huge optimism with Supernova. As much as I like Hoarder, Dardoch, Breezy, like that's probably around the 5th best team in the NACL, if that's like your core, if those are your best players. Ablaze Olive and Scary Jerry raised the ceiling of this team to incredible heights. I'm just gonna say it, Ablaze Olive was the best mid laner in the NACL last year. He was carrying Fearx Starforge for a lot of 2024, and while I do think that the entirety of that team was doing really well, ABO was clearly the main character in terms of where the resources were going and just how they wanted to play out their late games and all of that stuff. And honestly, there's no reason to believe that's going to change. I still have him coming in as the #1 mid laner because he was last year. Obviously, who knows? Like, who knows what kind of form he's going to be in as a game player, and whether or not he's going to come in and kind of dominate in the same way. Mid lane's very good right now, but again, if you would have asked me last year going in to 2025 who was the #1 mid laner in 2024 that you expected to continue in 2025, it would have been Ablaze Olive. He would have been the one player that I think from a tape perspective would have stood out. So again, maybe he doesn't translate it. Maybe he's not going to be able to keep up the form. I just kind of believe that he's going to be fine in the mid lane, especially playing off of someone really aggressive like Dardoch. And then Scary Jerry, the only shock is going to be that people are, going to see that I'm coming in #2 in terms of Scary Jerry in the AD carry role in the NACL right now. And we'll get to it. Tactical's really good. I think people just underestimate how good Tactical is, but Jerry is awesome. And honestly, he got completely screwed by Disguise. So there's no way around it. It's just an absolute travesty what ended up happening to him in Tier 1, because this was a guy who for most of this year was bad, right? Like Split 1, Winter Split, he was one of the worst players, if not the worst player in the LTA in that very weird, very dumb, tournament style format that they ended up playing. But in spring, when he finally got the chance to get his feet under him, he got better and better every single game. And for me, he was the best player on Disguise this past split. I think he did a lot of things really positively for that team, but they wanted to go in a different direction. They had the opportunity to bring in someone like Rahel, and Rahel is a very good player. I'm certainly not going to, lambast the team for feeling like Rahel can come in and help them right now when they're trying to stay in the LTA, but Scary Jerry has no business being back in Tier 2, and it just kind of disappoints me, but at least he gets the chance to play. Right now, it looks like Surdy doesn't even have a team, so, at least Scary Jerry gets to pilot, something in Tier 2, but this should be a fantastic addition. Jerry and Breezy might be a terrifying bot lane duo, and there is a very real shot that they have the best carry duo between ABO and Jerry in the entire league. Now, I will say this about Jerry. He has never really succeeded outside of playing with Yuji, and Yuji does generate a ton of resources for everybody on his team, at least at a high-end Tier 2 level. I think Jerry's better than that. I think Jerry's just the kind of player that needs time to adapt to a new level. It took him some time to get used to Tier 2. It was going to take him some time to get used to Tier 1, and we did see him getting better, but there is a world where Jerry's just a good, maybe not an unbelievable AD carry. I'm betting against that. I think this team is going to be terrifying. They come in at #2 in my power rankings. I really do believe that this team has a shot to win the entire league if they have good cohesion and if they can figure things out. The only reason I'm kind of betting against that right now is because it's tough for a team to just unite in the middle of July and figure it out enough to be the best team in the league by the end of the year. That's very little time to get your shot calling and all of your mental stuff out of the way. So this team is kind of, against the grain in terms of whether or not they're going to be able to win the league, but Supernova clearly trying to get into the LTA, and this team has a pretty good shot from a pure talent level to do that. But that's going to bring us to my #1 team, and you know who it is. By process of elimination, you know who this final team is. It's Luminosity Gaming. It's your defending champions coming in at #1, and how could it possibly be anybody else? You probably knew who it was going to be going into this video, but I guess I'll just confirm it for you. I think Luminosity is still the team to beat. In fact, I think they're by far the team to beat. You know how I talked about those groupings? I think 8 to 10, I think 5 to 7, I think 2 to 4 are kind of a grouping in and of themselves. I think Luminosity is a team that if they're not in the top 2 by the end of the split, something has gone horribly, horribly wrong. They're one of only 2 teams alongside Winthrop to not change a single member from the spring split, and I think that not only will that do them a lot of good, but just generally like having the best team in the league is a pretty good thing in terms of the talent that you have at your disposal. So let's go ahead and go over it. Their lineup is still looking like Fake God in the top lane, Tomio in the jungle, Insanity in the mid lane, Tactical at AD carry, and Zazel at support. We can just go one by one, kind of talking about everything that this team does right. You have Fake God in the top lane. Talk about a guy who just demolishes the NACL every single time he's here. Do I think that Fake God is playing as good right now as he did in 2023 when he was on Cloud9 and disguised and he was really kind of blowing up the league? Maybe not. I think that that version of Fake God was still a bit more impressive to me in terms of his ability to play out laning phases and dominate in the teamfight stage of the game, but he's still the best top laner in the league, especially because I don't think top lane is all that dominant right now. I think the only players that really are kind of in the consideration are, you know, I guess Tenacity if he ends up playing, because I like Tenacity, but Philip wasn't even in the NACL. He was number 2 on my list. You have Hoarder at number 3. Hoarder definitely wasn't better than Fake God. Like, top lane's just not all that deep of a position right now in terms of guaranteed star level talent in the NACL, and Fake God is going to be more than good enough to be able to beat a lot of those players. So I feel really good about Fake God coming in as the number 1 top laner, especially now with Zamudo in the LTA, but it's the rest of his team that, you know, continues to kind of carry through a lot of that dominance. Tomio goes up to being my number 1 jungler. Again, another position that I don't think is particularly dominant. Like, would Tomio be number 1 over, you know, other junglers like Yuji and, you know, Spica, who were obviously number 1 and 2 last split? You know, maybe not. He still probably wouldn't be above those guys, but Tomio is a really good player, and I think he found his groove once again on Luminosity. It's clear that in general, Shopify really mishandled a lot of the players they brought up last year, including Fake God and Tomio, and it's nice to see them get back to their own little, you know, play style. I still think he's most comfortable on these tank facilitators, things like Maokai and Sejuani, but you want him to play carries, he got that back this year. That was something he didn't have for Shopify last year. It's nice to see him have that. Insanity in the mid lane was the player that I was like, you know, I wasn't really thinking about him a lot in the regular season, if I'm being honest. He was the one player where I didn't really ever feel like he popped off or was carrying the team. And then he had like the most dominant finals I've ever seen. It was the best series he had played all year by far, was finals MVP. No doubt for Luminosity when they ended up winning that. What a great time for him to step up and really be consistent. Of course, Insanity known for a lot of his insane picks in the mid lane, things like Graves mid, things like Scion mid. Like, that's, you know, the thing that I always remember him for, but he's still a very good, like, actual mid lane player. He can play control mages, he can play aggressive carries like Yone in the mid lane. He can do whatever you really need him to do in the middle of the map. He's great on marksman in the mid lane as well. That's really his meta in terms of how things go. So I still love Insanity. Insanity wasn't better than Ablaze Olive last year, at least in terms of the tape that I saw, and so that's the reason he comes in at number 2. And again, for most of the split, he was just good. He was just kind of a part of the team until he really started to click in the playoffs, and again, specifically in the finals. But, you know, if Insanity's number 1 on your list, like, come on, like, I'm not going to argue that. That's certainly not something I'm against. And Tactical is coming in number 1, which I think is going to be against the grain for a lot of people with Scary Jerry coming back to the league. But that's just how highly I view Tactical. At this point, I think he's crazy underrated. I don't really understand what people aren't, you know, liking about his gameplay. Is he a little bit too aggressive sometimes? Maybe, but he's the most mechanically talented player in the NACL. I don't even think that's really all that arguable. This guy can win fights that nobody else can in any role at this level, and he was really important to Luminosity's success. And I think most importantly, what really elevated Tactical for me last split is when you think about Tactical as a player, you think of a lane dominant, you know, player that's going to play for team fights, and he's going to be super aggressive. He's going to constantly try to skirmish, constantly try to step up, very Jackie Love-esque in terms of his playstyle. He was more than willing to be a weak side bot laner last split, and that's not something we've really seen from Tactical throughout his entire career. So if he's going to add that layer onto his game, and if he's going to be very adept at doing that, man, all of a sudden you're looking at the best player in the NACL, not even just the best, like, bot laner, you know what I mean? Like, that's how good Tactical can be. And then you have Zazel. The only reason Zazel doesn't come in at number 1 is because I'm in love with Zyko, is because I just really like him as a player. But Zazel, talk about a player who really started peaking down the stretch. He was awesome at the end of the regular season, like the last 1 or 2 weeks of the regular season. He was one of the best players in the league, and he was awesome in the playoffs. He was the best support in the league in the playoffs without any sort of debate. Like, he truly was incredible in those games. And so, you know, you're looking at a bot lane that's probably the best in the league. You're looking at a top side that's probably the best in the league, and Luminosity coming off of a championship already. These guys have shown that they have good macro when they play together. What really is there not to like? Luminosity is a tier above everybody else who's trying to get on their level right now in the NACL. I think that they are big favorites to win once again, at least until proven otherwise, and quite frankly, right now, I think they're big favorites to be playing in the LTA in 2026 with this roster, because I think they're more than good enough to beat Disguised in a series to qualify. So for Luminosity, honestly, just really excited to see if they can keep their form up, because if they can, this is going to be a team that runs tier 2. All right, but that is going to do it for my NACL Summer Split 2025 Primer and Power Rankings video. Super excited to get into the Summer Split. You know, we're done, we're wrapping everything up, but I would really appreciate if you guys left a like on this video. As you guys know, the Primer videos are the ones we go the most in-depth for. It's a little bit tough because MSI just ended, so I had to really cram in a lot of tape watching coming into, you know, this video, but I definitely got it in, and we definitely wanted to make sure, you know, it came out well prepared, and so I do hope you guys enjoyed, and if you did, leave a like. Again, so much effort on these videos, it really does mean a lot, but we're also going to be posting more about the NACL, as per usual. Every single week, we're going to have a weekly recap on this channel talking about every single game, every single player, every single thing that happens throughout the entirety of the split. If you want to get ready for a potential promotion tournament matchup between whoever ends up winning the NACL and Disguised in the LTA, then this is the place to get that information, and obviously, we're going to be covering a bunch of the other regions as well, all of the top 4, so LTA North, LEC, LCK, and LPL. The primer for the LPL will be out a little bit later on in the week, again, because they start on the weekend as well, and then LCK is out at the beginning of next week, and then, you know, LTA and LEC are around the corner. Their splits start a little bit later than everybody else's. Thank God I have a little bit of time to prepare for those, but if you're interested in those primers and you want to see my analysis on the NACL for the rest of the year or those other leagues, hit subscribe and hit that bell so you can be notified when all of those videos do go live. But with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all later.